This is Twit.
The Federal Communications Commission today voted in favor of a preliminary proposal by Chairman Tom Wheeler to allow paid prioritization or internet fast lanes, which could kill net neutrality in the United States. But the FCC asked for additional public comment, including whether the internet access service should be reclassified as a telecommunications service or, a common carrier like the telephone system is. And with us to discuss this is Sebastian Anthony, who's a writer for PC Mag and Extreme Tech. We also have John Healy, an opinion columnist for the Los Angeles Times, and Alex Wilhelm, a writer for TechCrunch. So we'll start with you, Alex Wilhelm, because you're on the screen. How would the new rules, if they were actually adopted, change the internet in the United States? You get the big question today.
Well, what's very frustrating is we haven't actually gotten our hands on the full text. They released a preliminary overview right after the vote. So we have kind of the gist of it, but not the final details. So on something this complex, we're going to want to make sure we get into the weeds and get a full understanding. But right now, it appears that the overall net neutrality chunk will be no blocking of content, no slowing of content, and some paid prioritization with very strict rules about what that means. This is a disappointment. I think that everyone on this show today would be in agreement that we didn't want this to happen, that there would be any paid prioritization allowed. But happily, we have a 60-day period to input comment and then 57 more days of reply. So we have about 4 months to debate and discuss this. So it's not a done issue yet, but certainly this wasn't the vote we wanted to see this morning.
Now, it seems to me that Tom Wheeler is playing the politics on this thing like a violin. As I understand it, there are 3 general levels of regulation. And, of course, regulation is a big hot-button issue for the right. Now, this vote split across party lines. The 3 Democrats on the panel agreed with going forward with these proposals. The 2 Republicans are against it. And as I understand it, there are 3 levels. As I said, there's reclassifying this as a public utility, which is the maximum regulation. It would basically make internet providers like the phone company, where they have to do exactly what the government tells them to do. So that's maximum regulation. The minimum regulation is what Tom Wheeler is proposing, and he's basically saying that we'll regulate it a little bit, and there'll be this whole process for redress if people feel like they're not getting the internet service that they paid for, and so on. And then the absolute minimum regulation is where there is no net neutrality, and it's just whatever the internet providers want to do. So what he seems to be doing, and this is just my own view, is that he wants the middle road. He wants the little bit more regulation route, a little bit of net neutrality, a little bit of not net neutrality, and he's dangling out this public. He's allowing 3 or 4 months of public comment on this to talk in part about whether or not we reclassify these things as public utilities. That's the poison pill, essentially, for the right. They don't want maximum regulation, and of course, he doesn't want zero regulation. So it seems to be that he's playing this so that he gets exactly what he's after, this thing that he's calling something that preserves net neutrality, which in fact does not preserve net neutrality. Now, John Healy, this is my own personal view, and can you tell me if that is inaccurate in any way?
Well, it's inaccurate in the sense that you just used the word fact. First off, as Alex noted, we haven't seen the proposal. We're talking about what we know from a fact sheet. So the devil's in the details. We need to get into that. But as Wheeler has said repeatedly throughout this process, he doesn't want to change the goals that the FCC set in 2010. The problem, as the courts have said, not just in earlier this year, but before, when the FCC tried to enforce a very similar set of principles that hadn't been adopted as rules, is that there are limitations on the FCC's authority. So the question is, what's possible here? If Wheeler is saying that he really doesn't think that the FCC can allow a universe that has fast lanes, and he thinks that Section 706 authority is the way to achieve that, let's have a comment period and let's hear what people have to say about that. Not saying from the very start, oh, well, he's committed us to a set of fast lanes. I mean, if you listen to just what he said at the meeting today, and you read the speech that he gave to the cable show a few weeks ago, it's pretty clear that this guy doesn't want to have the universe that people are saying he's leading us toward.
Well, and I'll throw this open to Sebastian Anthony in just a second, but my own view is that he's counting on the ignorance of the public here, and so those of us who watch a show like I'll explain that. I'll explain that in just a sec. The reality is that over time we the public expect internet speeds to get faster and faster and faster. He's saying that it's net neutrality is protected because the companies won't be able to dial it down. In other words, they won't be able to force a slow lane. So theoretically, if speeds stay the same for people who are not paying the carriers extra, right, then that is within the limits of what he's proposing here. I mean, we expect carriers like Comcast and so on to continuously upgrade their networks, but if their incentive is to get paid by the people who pay extra for a fast lane, then what incentive does Comcast and the other internet providers have to provide faster internet connectivity for the rest of us?
If you look at what he said about the no blocking rule, which admittedly is edgy legally in terms of 706 authority, but he said that the way they're approaching this is that content providers have to have access to their end users without having to pay for that. And end users have to have access to content providers based on what their expectations are for what they're paying for. In other words, if they get slower and slower service, that would be under the Wheeler definition of commercially unreasonable. That would be commercially unreasonable.
Exactly. So, Sebastian Anthony, I mean, can you address this essential point? I mean, clearly, I don't think anybody's expecting the internet to get slower. He's basically saying if it gets slower, that's against the rules, and we'll address that. Our expectation is, if everything else being equal, that it should get faster and faster and faster, as it has done over the last 2 decades. We expect internet speeds delivered to the home for for a given dollar to be double, triple into the future. But again, what's the incentive for the internet providers to double and triple it for those of us who are not paying, who are not getting content by people who are not paying for it? Sebastian Anthony, what do you think about that?
As John mentioned, so we have Wheeler saying one thing. Like, he said some amazing things. He said, there is one internet, not a fast internet, not a slow internet, one internet. So I'm quoting him there. And he also says the internet must be fast, it must be robust, it must be open. So he says all these things, and then apparently we're voting for fast lanes, or that's the actual proposal is for fast lanes. So there's a disparity here between what he's saying and what we're proposing. And so, I mean, on the one hand, you have the politics of it. Like, if they can get this in, if they can kind of slip this in and we can start doing the fast lane thing, and then, as someone mentioned, that the consumer, they're ignorant to this, and so it will just happen without noticing. But on the other hand, it's a dangerous precedent to set. And as you say, internet speeds get faster and faster. But also it's worth noting that none of these companies like Time Warner, Comcast, they're not hurting money-wise, and they're not spending huge amounts of money on infrastructure as it is. They're saying that they need these fast lane rules to protect their infrastructure investments. But, I saw a graph today that shows, with inflation-adjusted spending, their spending is not increasing. And the previous rule in 2010 from the FCC didn't increase spending either. So I think there's a lot of, it doesn't seem, there's maybe some lies floating around or it's not entirely clear what's actually going to happen here and what people actually want and what's political and what's trying to fleece the consumer. It's a complex situation, and I'm worried that the FCC will try and slip something through that we will then not have much control over.